When speaking of reasoning, the pattern which ultimately emerges is that of open and closed systems. In its dealings with the physical world, humans run up against the blockade of informational incompleteness. No single person knows everything, and even pooling their knowledge, a society knows relatively little compared to the great unknowns beyond the scope of immediate human concerns. But knowing so little has not deadened our activities. Despite it, humans manage to navigate pretty well by undertaking proximate actions with entities of immediate concern. Humans make shortcuts. I take something which is incomplete, I slice off the trailing datasets, and I declare what remains as good enough. Because I do not know everything about physicality, I cannot actually say anything exists within a purely closed system. By imposing artificial limits, I can apply systems of closed laws to relatively stable structures and achieve heuristic models of how best to interact with them. In looking at the Organon, I discussed validity, a stricture of rules which applies to arguments by creating a closed system out of a set of statements. Doing so, I intended to maximize the information obtained through the interconnected relationship between those statements, while simultaneously rejecting information that originates outside of them. The main problem with validity is that without accepting more truths than those which are purely axiomatic, there is a very small limit on the number of relations to which deductive logic can apply. This limitation makes it exceedingly difficult to translate logic into the vast territory of language surrounding it. However, logic can be exercised, largely by paraphrasing complex relationships. Many complex relationships are compounds which contain an axiomatic relation along with other less defined relations. As such, for the complex relation to exist, the axiomatic relation must be regarded as necessary. A paraphrase works with this by removing the unconfirmed relation and focusing on the simpler axiomatic relation. For example, the relation if-then does not have universally determinable truth values purely through axiomatic means. In the argument if x then y, one cannot say whether the argument is true or false in any instance where x is false. However, the relation if-then implies the relation either or both. So in order to have a basically functional set of interpretations, the complex relation if-then can be paraphrased as or, and still hold a significant portion of its original meaning. In this way, many of the rules for determining truth values basically apply to the complex relations used in language. If not to the extent of mathematically derived laws, then at least to a functional one, where logical arguments can be brought to a wider range of propositions where they occur in ordinary language. In light of this, it can be said that there is a small degree to which arguments can apply to large bodies of information, though not in as clear-cut a manner as I would like. Once questions and commands are discounted and observed as components of stated actions, and once certain indeterminate statements are removed from a list of propositions, then what remains is part of a closed system. This pruning is as applicable to a paragraph as it is to an entire novel. As such, it can be said that a body of literature is a closed system to which many of the rules of deductive reasoning can be applied. Argumentation can then be applied to a literary work's propositions in a number of ways. It is common for stories to involve the passage of time, so cause and effect undoubtedly feature in such stories, as does correlation. When some propositions are further isolated from the text, their combination can yield their own conclusion. though it is also important to check to see if such a conclusion is consistent with other propositions outside of those regarded as premises. As literature is a human endeavor, there is no guarantee that this will be the case, though consistency is generally accepted as the aim which adds to a story's coherency. Further, it may be the case that all the given propositions combine into a string of arguments from which a single conclusion can be deduced, and this conclusion is the moral or meaning of the story. Literature can contain many smaller deductions, which are regarded as morals of a story, but without the argument more or less based on every proposition in the text, a reader is left questioning the meaning for the inclusion of some propositions. It is easy, in the face of such propositions, to state that they were left there to engage or amuse the reader, to make the story more enjoyable. Or, to a harsh critic, such propositions may be regarded as unnecessary, and only detract from the work itself, and the particular interpretation or moral that critic favors. But at that point, the idea of authorial intention starts to creep in. It is necessary to ask whether the meaning of a story is always what the author intended when it was written. Are authors consciously aware of all the deductions present in their works, or do they create blindly? Composing a work of literature is itself a very difficult task, and it is not the case that all writers are also logicians. So I think it is fair to say that for the most part, literature is formed from vague intuitions, threaded with rhetoric and perhaps one or more certain points the writer is trying to get across. At its point of final execution, a story holds more and less than the writer wanted for it at the point of first intention. It is fair to say that the experiences of a writer of literature affect what goes into their work. A man who was marooned in the South Seas and lived among a cannibal tribe is likely to view the humanity of cannibals more favorably than one who sits on the far side of the world and imagines horrors. In this way, knowing more about the author gives clues as to what is important to them, and what is important to them can become a conclusive theme in their work. No closed system is truly closed. To a greater or lesser degree, things outside of a system affect what go on inside it. Considering authorial intention can give a number of new propositions to add to the list contained within a body of literature, though by accepting them, one is opening a closed system, inviting more opportunities for conflict, guesswork, and trailing datasets to specify the meaning of a work and strip it of its general applicability. I'm not saying this should never be done, but I am saying that it is the work of a historian rather than a literary critic. In avoiding sophistical elenchi, an argument has to be considered as a thing apart from the one presenting it, and only by this method can the argument itself be tested for truth and validity. In order to preserve this barrier, it helps to know nothing of an author when first reading a book one is going to critique. On a second reading, one should feel free to know the author's intention and enjoy the historical significance of their work. With all this in mind, I would say that logical skills can be applied, very basically, to literature, possibly even more successfully than those skills could in more open systems. And because of this, literature is an incredibly potent tool for communicating simple deductions while ensuring that they are more or less validly derived. That does not always mean that the premises of such an argument are true, and in the vast majority of cases, literature is imaginative and oversimplifies. Perhaps the greatest benefit of stories is that they can make me aware of patterns which may exist which I had not fully considered as operative in the real world, and, taking them up as viable hypotheses, I can attempt to falsify them by comparing those stories to real life. I gain knowledge not by finding the one true course, but by dismissing its alternatives.